service. And on our website, you can explore more of our programmes, from documentaries to science. Listen and download at any time by going to bbcworldservice.com. On air, online and on smartphones, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall. Russia continues its relentless bombardment of the southern Ukrainian city of Mariupol.
There is massive destruction. It's very sad, but the street on which this hospital is created, the name of the Street of Peace, and now the Street of Peace destroyed.
We'll also be hearing from Irpin on the outskirts of the capital, Kyiv, where people have been emerging from underground shelters, and from the western city of Lviv, bracing for attacks. We ask America's UN ambassador about fears that Russia might deploy chemical weapons in Ukraine, and the UN tells us of attempts to reach those trapped by the fighting and of the growing exodus from the country.
It is already exceeding our worst expectations, and the figure gets out of date as soon as you say it. It will be another 100,000 by the time we finish speaking.
That's all coming up after the latest news.
BBC News with Sue Montgomery. Charities are warning of appalling conditions in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol, which is being besieged by Russian troops. The International Red Cross says many people have run out of food and water in freezing temperatures. Attempted evacuations have repeatedly failed as the bombardment continues. Richard Dalpin reports.
The ICRC team in Mariupol says people in the city are now fighting each other for food. Some have also been siphoning fuel from other people's cars. All the shops and pharmacies in the area have been looted. With no gas supplies and the temperature at night expected to drop to -5 Celsius, it'll be very difficult to keep warm. The ICRC team is warning that people are already starting to get sick.
European Union leaders are meeting just outside Paris to discuss introducing tougher sanctions on Russia. They're addressing further ways of stopping the EU's reliance on Russian food and energy supplies, as well as boosting defence capabilities. The French President Emmanuel Macron said a ceasefire wasn't yet in sight.
The facts are the following. Russia decided to launch a war. Russia is bombing Ukraine. Russia is bombing even civilians. And in parallel, you have a negotiation, but this negotiation is not ready to be concluded. So I don't see the ceasefire realistic in the coming hours, to be honest with you.
The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the EU still needed to do everything possible to convince the Kremlin to end the war. The mayor of Kyiv says close to 2 million people, nearly half of its population, have fled the city. Vitaly Klitschko said the Ukrainian capital has been turned into a fortress. The UN now says more than 2.3 million people across Ukraine have fled to neighbouring countries. Martin Griffiths is the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator.
Those who have left Ukraine are the ones who have made an early decision that they can leave. Those remaining are often people who have no resources, who are left, obviously, stuck in places like Mariupol as well, and who are very, very seriously in need. It is a viral humanitarian situation and extremely difficult to get ahead of.
Russian forces are edging nearer to Kyiv, with reports of battles with Ukrainian troops for control of the main highway. The British government has imposed sanctions on 7 Russian oligarchs, including the owner of Chelsea Football Club, Roman Abramovich. Mr. Abramovich and 6 others, including his former business partner, Oleg Deripaska, are seen as closely connected to President Putin. The decision leaves the future of the Premier League side in doubt. The sale of the club is now on hold. World News from the BBC. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has said that sanctions against his country are not legitimate. He told a video conference of his ministers that Western leaders were deceiving their own people. He said that despite the US decision to ban Russian oil imports, his government would adhere to its obligations on global energy supplies. In other news, doctors in Sudan say 2 people have been shot dead as protests continue against military rule. since last year's coup, at least 87 people have been killed and hundreds wounded. UN and African Union officials have warned the country is in grave danger. This report from Will Ross.
It's clear that in Sudan there's an overwhelming desire for the military to leave power. The protests since October's coup have been relentless, but the army chief, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and his senior colleagues appear determined to stay in charge, and so protesters are facing bullets on the streets. An AU envoy has called for a resumption of the transition to civilian rule. Mohamed Labat urged civilian factions to iron out their differences and seek a consensus. He warned that if they remained split, power would stay with the Sudanese military.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has appointed Raymond Zondo as the country's new Chief Justice. Mr. Zondo chaired an inquiry into endemic corruption under the previous President Jacob Zuma. The 4-year investigation into what's known as state capture brought to light damning allegations against government officials and the private sector. South Africa's Judicial Service Commission had recommended a different candidate. A court in Paris has rejected a request by the French actor Gérard Depardieu to have a rape investigation against him dropped. Depardieu, who's 73, is accused of raping and sexually assaulting a young French actress, Charlotte Arnault, at his home in Paris. He firmly rejected the accusations. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from our studios in central London. I'm Julian Marshall. As we enter the third week of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, diplomacy is not for the moment going to end the conflict. The first high-level talks between Ukraine and Russia have ended with no progress, even on a 24-hour ceasefire to bring aid to civilians. And so the Russian bombardment of towns and cities across Ukraine continues remorselessly in the southern port city of Mariupol, where on Wednesday Ukraine accused Russian forces of bombing a maternity and children's hospital. Russia has denied this, and today the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, following those talks with his Ukrainian counterpart in Turkey, said a Ukrainian militia known as Azov was responsible for the attack. It's not the first time we see pathetic outcries concerning the so-called atrocities perpetrated by the Russian military. On the 7th of March, 3 days ago, on the 7th or the 6th, I don't recall exactly now, at the Security Council at the UN, facts were proffered by our delegation saying that that maternity hospital had been taken over by the Azov battalion and others, and that all the mothers about to give birth and the nurses were chased out of there. And that was the base of the ultra-radical Azov battalion. That data was proffered 3 days ago. You can draw your own conclusions as to how public opinion is manipulated worldwide. The words of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and I spoke earlier to Ukrainian opposition member of parliament Yaroslav Zelezniak. He grew up in Mariupol and has family and friends in the city. First of all, I put Mr. Lavrov's claim to him.
It is not true. It is fake from Lavrov and from Russian government, as they always do. Because I know this hospital. My mother worked here. My grandmother worked here. I know from my friends that it still was the hospital. There's a lot of child. There's a lot of pregnant women. And there is no military base in the hospital or near the hospital. It was a just child hospital. It was renovated like 2 years ago. And it was very fancy and very good hospital.
And you have close connections with the hospital. Tell me about them.
My mother worked here. It was like 10 years ago, but she worked here. This was the main hospital now in the Donetsk region, which held all children. I also remember when I was ill, I go to this hospital with my mom. My grandmother worked here. So it was a big hospital. There was 3 or 4 buildings, so it is not the smallest one. And everyone, and I'm sure, even the Russian soldiers understand there is no way to some military troops from Ukraine to be inside this hospital. It is impossible.
Can it still be used as a hospital, or is it beyond repair?
It is beyond repair. If you see there is massive destruction, it's very sad, but the street on which this hospital is situated. The name of the street is Street of Peace, and now the Street of Peace is destroyed.
So the Russian bombardment of Mariupol has continued today, Thursday.
Yeah. I have seen photos from here, and they continue. That's why it's very important, and we are highlighting once again that we need to close the sky on Mariupol and in Ukraine, because my sister now in Mariupol, I spoke with her 2 days for 1 minute because there is no mobile connection, there is no water, there is no food, there is no electricity, there is no any other services, and the connection was so bad, so I spoke just 1 minute, and after that I lost the connection. And now the situation is very horrible. We have 1,300 deaths among civilians who have been killed by bombing in Mariupol. There is no way to get out from here. 3 times we tried to organize the corridor for evacuation, and 3 times it was shooting not only in militaries but in this humanitarian transport.
Why do you think the Russians are directing so much firepower on Mariupol?
Mariupol, it is one of the eastern towns, and it is now on the way from occupied Crimea to the Russia. It's one of the biggest cities in Ukraine. There is a lot of industrial plants, there is the port, railway infrastructure. It's very important for them to occupy it. But I know the people from Mariupol and from here. There is no pro-Russian people in Mariupol. They don't want Russia. Mariupol is a very nice city. Before the bombing, it was very nice. One of the most modern cities in Ukraine. There's a lot of renovation. There's a lot of new monuments with new square, with music content, with a lot of new cafes. Now my city has been for 2 weeks destroyed. Yesterday and today there was massive graves in 2022. Massive graves. 40 people have been buried without any names, without any monument. And that's why I don't understand the position of the NATO and the Western country. If you are for democratic principles and democratic aims, why you not should close our sky? We're asking for that.
What do you think should happen in Mariupol? Because clearly the Russians are not going to stop the bombardment of the city. Do you think that Mariupol should surrender and spare the civilian population from any further bombardment?
I think there is 2 ways. Russia has already surrendered it, and there is no way to get out from here. I know it because my sister is here now. And the second way is I hope that a Western country will close the sky, or will make no fly zone. Because if we're talking about Russian soldiers, we are not afraid of that. But we still have the problem with the sky.
That was Yaroslav Zelezniak, Ukrainian opposition MP, and himself a native of Mariupol. He was speaking to me from Kiev. Well, the conflict in Ukraine has led to a mass exodus. The UN estimates that 2.2 million people have now been forced to flee to neighbouring countries, and that figure doesn't take into account those who braved humanitarian corridors in towns and cities across Ukraine to seek safety elsewhere in the country, the internally displaced. The mayor of Kiev, for instance, says close to 2 million people, nearly half the population, have fled the city. Martin Griffiths is a veteran of these mass displacements of populations in Yemen, Ethiopia, Syria and South Sudan. He's the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. His reaction to what is unfolding in Ukraine.
I think Filippo Grandi, the Refugee High Commissioner, has described it as the fastest growing refugee crisis since the Second World War. And as you know, the numbers now of refugees is 2.2 million. But strikingly, we have also an estimate now of 1.8 million internally displaced. So I think the first thing is that it is a viral humanitarian situation and extremely difficult to get ahead of. But that is exactly what is now being put into place by our people in the field, is trying to get across the horizon. So getting people into the east, which I'm very happy to speak more on.
2.3 million people have crossed the borders into neighbouring countries already, and I think the United Nations has projected that that figure might rise to as high as 5 million.
I think so, and I think at the launch Filippo Grandi talked about maybe up to 4 million, but I think you're right to say it could go to 5 because it is already exceeding our worst expectations. And the figure gets out of date as soon as you say it. It'll be another 100,000. By the time we finish speaking. So the tragedy of the Ukrainian people, I think, is one which we have rarely seen.
Obviously, everyone fleeing from conflict needs help, needs assistance. But what are you prioritizing? Those who have left Ukraine or those who are internally displaced within the country?
We don't divide between them. We don't prioritize one over the other. Those who have left Ukraine are the ones who have made an early decision that they can leave. Those remaining are often people who have no resources, who are left, obviously, stuck in places like Mariupol as well, and who are very, very seriously in need. So we have a regional operation supporting the neighboring states and the regions who are welcoming refugees into their midst. That's led by Filippo Grandi, and I am responsible for the in-country, in Ukraine, humanitarian assistance plan. But let me just say one thing. The internally displaced are a specific group, obviously in need, and we are setting up reception centers and providing them assistance. Most of them are in Western Ukraine at the moment. But it's the people who are still at home who are our gravest worry, partly because they are unable to leave, because the agreements on corridors don't hold sufficiently, partly because they don't have the resources to leave. And so getting assistance to them where they are, where they live, is, for somebody in my position, the principal preoccupation.
Are you managing that?
Well, yes, it's beginning. So the World Food Programme has sent in, I think it's 76 metric tons of wheat flour into Kyiv by train. WHO has sent medical supplies into the capital as well. We're using cash, which can go directly to beneficiaries or to local organizations in these cities, the ones which are encircled, to enable them to go and get free handouts from the local supermarkets or bakeries in Kharkiv, where the World Food Programme has arranged for them to provide free bread to those in need.
Are you in touch at all with the Russian government, the Russian authorities, to try to see whether there is greater observance of those humanitarian corridors?
As soon as the war started, I was immediately in touch with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Russian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, Sergei Vershinin, who was very helpful in getting us to have contacts with the Russian Ministry of Defense. We needed and we need contacts with the Russian military, which, as you know, is standard in these situations. We have a team in Moscow meeting daily with the Russian MOD on how to do a proper deconfliction system. And that means that you decide that on a certain day at a certain hour there will be a certain route which is identified. There will be disposition of forces clearly identified. There will be a hotline in the case of a crisis. The leader of the convoy will also have a contact. So we're making progress in Moscow, but we're doing exactly the same with the Ukrainian military as well and the Ukrainian government, who are very, very actively cooperating with us.
With all due respect, Mr. Griffiths, I mean, the kind of contacts you're having with the authorities in Moscow do not seem to be producing results on the ground. I mean, there have been multiple instances of those humanitarian corridors not being opened, of civilians being fired at as they pass through the corridors. And in the case of Mariupol, of course, people not able to get out of the city at all because of intense Russian bombardments.
I don't think I claimed that we have achieved that success. In fact, I have been very clear publicly as well as privately that we're not there yet. We have yet to have clear agreement with the Russian military on the sort of things that I was just describing, which I think are the basis of having effective corridors or effective movements. And we don't have that at the moment, and that doesn't exist at the moment. That's why I think we see these terrible events.
That was Martin Griffiths, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. He was speaking from New York. Still to come, as Russia continues to attack Ukrainian cities and towns, many people are trying to flee to safety. We'll hear from one man who's returning. I'm going into the town of Irpin because there are young children in basements, there are people who don't have any bread, water or electricity. There are retired and disabled people, pregnant women who need to be taken to the hospital so that they can have their babies. The latest headlines from the BBC Newsroom. Aid agencies are warning of the humanitarian crisis at the besieged Ukrainian port of Mariupol, which is being bombarded by Russian forces. And European Union leaders are meeting in France to discuss how to increase pressure on President Putin to end the war. This is Julian Marshall with Newshour live from the BBC in London. With fierce fighting along Ukraine's south coast, the key city of Odessa is preparing its defences. The Ukrainian president has warned that Russia plans to bomb the city. Russian landing craft have been seen off the coast and several aircraft reportedly shot down. Odessa is seen as an important target, both strategic and symbolic. The BBC has obtained footage of the volunteers preparing to defend the city just 50 kilometres from the border with Moldova. Our correspondent on that border, Lucy Williamson, reports.
At a secret location on the outskirts of Odessa, teenagers are preparing for the Russian army to arrive. A painstaking production line for Molotov cocktails set up by civil defence volunteers. Corks are hammered in one by one, bottles neatly packed into crates. Kolya is 16. My job is to test the Molotov cocktails, he says. I'm not very good at chemistry, but now I'm here doing this stuff.
We are strong, we will never give up.
Nikita is just a year older. He tried to enlist in the army when the war began, but they wouldn't take him. He was too young. Vadim, also 16, is asked if he's afraid. Yes, he says. A short distance away, in a derelict building, flurries of snow blow through broken windows onto piles of grey rubble as volunteers spray target marks on the blackened walls. Danilo, his face hidden by a hooded jacket, takes aim. 2 weeks ago, Danilo was in his final year at law school. Now he's testing the homemade bombs to check they've got the recipe right. When did you learn how to make them? Someone asks him. It seems it's a fourth-year optional course, he quips. Bogdan is a more senior figure in the movement. He was in Kyiv looking for work when the war began.
My family said I had to come back home because they needed my help. Ukrainians across the country have met the Russian aggressors with these weapons.
The team here have been making 2 crates of Molotov cocktails a day. It's like making soup, Bogdan says. You have to do everything step by step. Odessa is now a city in waiting. Its beaches gouged to fill sandbags. Its opera house ringed with barricades. Its residents watching conflicts in cities to the east and Russian ships off the coast. 50 kilometers from Odessa, the queue to leave Ukraine is filled with the city's women and children. Angela has just crossed into Moldova with 3 children. Her elder daughter is back home, serving in the Ukrainian army. They decided to leave when the Russians destroyed the military barracks in their village. We spent 3 days living in the basement of our house, Angela tells me. On the other side of the border, the queue inches forward in a slow, languid dance towards another dusk, another night. A guitar player keeps his fellow refugees entertained with a song. Exhausted from the long road, the lyrics say, energy spent. I ask for a place to sleep. Let me inside. I won't disappoint. I'll tell you many stories if you want.
Lucy Williamson reporting, and let's turn away from Ukraine briefly to talk about sacrifice zones. It's the term being given by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, and